Hello, my name is Eric Patterson, and this is the Religious Freedom Institute's 3 Questions on Ukraine interview series. At the Religious Freedom Institute, we work to secure religious freedom for everyone, everywhere around the world. The purpose of the 3 Questions on Ukraine interview series in the context of the ongoing conflict there is to increase understanding, and in particular, understanding of the religious dynamics of the region and the many dimensions of religious freedom in Ukraine. My guest today is Rebecca Heinrichs. Rebecca L. Heinrichs is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, specializing in U.S. national defense policy with a focus on strategic deterrence. She writes for many popular and academic journals and magazines, including serving as a contributing editor to Providence, a journal of American foreign policy and Christianity. She serves as an adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics, and previously in her career, she served in the U.S. House of Representatives as an advisor to a U.S. congressman, where she focused on matters related to the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee. Rebecca, thank you for joining us today.
No, it's so good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's jump right in here. The news 3 weeks into this conflict is very confusing. Are Russia's actions as bad as they seem? And what do you think is Vladimir Putin's goal in all of this?
So a big component of Russia's war against Ukraine is this information warfare, and that's why it is so hard to get a handle on what is true, because both sides, the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, are engaging in information with the intent to bolster their side, of course, and so it's hard to know, what is true and how things are going and what is happening. The short answer to that question is yes, the Russians really are as bad as the news seems to see. They are, as each day goes on, the Russians are increasing their target set, what they are willing to hit. They are obviously hitting cities, they're hitting residential areas. They are, there was confirmed reporting that the Russians had laid mines along humanitarian corridors, which is just a gross violation of, obviously of just the moral law, what Christians understand, but also of just war. And so it's a war crime. And then they are knowingly targeting areas where they know that would cause significant civilian casualties, and they're using particular weapons that are designed to create a much larger indiscriminate impact, and they're using those in cities as well. The Ukrainians are fighting up a good fight. They're putting up a good fight. They are fighting valiantly. They've been very well trained and well disciplined, and so they are thwarting a lot of the military gains that the Russians thought that they would easily have in the first few days of the invasion. But unfortunately, the Russian military still has a lot more combat power, more men to send, and more military capabilities. And so there is an asymmetry in what the Ukrainian military can do versus the Russians, and they can't do any of it without the continued robust supply of US and NATO ally weapon systems that we are sending in, mostly through the Polish border.
Would you tell us a bit about the nuclear dimension here?
Sure. So there is a nuclear dimension to this war. Just a little bit of background. A lot of times Americans think of nuclear weapons, they think the Cold War, mutually assured destruction, and that if there was a nuclear employment, that would be nuclear Armageddon. That's kind of how a lot of Americans just intuitively think of nuclear weapons. But the Russians have been thinking about nuclear weapons very differently since the Cold War. They have invested very specifically in theater range nuclear weapons that have lower yields. And the United States has divested from those kinds of capabilities and really invested more in the strategic weapon systems that can reach long distances, obviously for their deterrent value to protect the American people and our way of life and our allies. And so, the way deterrence works is you credibly threaten that you're willing and able to use these particular weapon systems in defense of your vital interests. And it only works if it's credible. So it only works if your adversaries believe that you'll do it. And that's the paradox about deterrence. Well, the Russians think about nuclear weapons differently than we do. They actually, military doctrine considers using lower yield nuclear weapons in theater if they come up against NATO or European country and they begin to lose in a conventional conflict, that they might escalate, cross the nuclear threshold, use these horrifying weapons, even at a lower yield. And it would cause the Europeans, the United States, NATO to say, forget it, we're not going to retaliate any further, you can have it, out of a fear that the West might have of escalation. So the challenge for the United States is always to convince our adversaries that how they might think of employing these would be a mistake. And so, it is, again, it kind of gets to this paradox in thinking, but it's actually the wrong response to be intimidated by that, because you unintentionally can incentivize the Russians doing that horrifying thing that they are essentially kind of threatening to do and doing this nuclear saber rattling. That what we actually have to do is calmly. Now, I still think the risks are very, very low for this, because it would be such a dramatic breaking of acceptable behavior and crossing the nuclear threshold. But I don't think we should discount it as a bluff. I think we should understand the Russians as they see themselves and understand that this could very well be how they're thinking. And so the right response is to convey to the Russians that any kind of nuclear employment would elicit a response from the NATO alliance that would cause the Russians to regret that decision. Now, we don't have to say what that would be, but we are a nuclear alliance as well. And we do have proportional capabilities that would be credible in the minds of the Russians that we might use in retaliation. But that has to be strong, and it has to be so convincing to the Russians that they believe it. And so it's actually the wrong response for the Biden administration there was a test that we had. The United States had a long planned missile test that we can put nuclear weapons on. It was an unarmed test. It was just a flight test, long planned. The Russians knew that we had it planned. And in the face of this nuclear saber rattling that the Russians have been doing so irresponsibly and provocatively, the Biden administration canceled that test and said that they didn't want to do anything that could be misunderstood by the Russians as provocative. Of course, I disagree with that decision. I think, now is the time to really steady as she goes with resolve and confidence in a cool head, demonstrate that we will not go weak-kneed, that we will defend our vital interests, and that any kind of nuclear employment would be that would be a mistake for the Russians to make that decision. So that is the kind of the sort of veiled, that's the cloud that's hanging over this terrible war in Ukraine.
I'd like to pull a little bit more on nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, two additional elements. One is, how do nuclear power plants, for instance, attacks on them play into this, or the Russians destroying one on their way out of the country, for instance, and creating a fiasco, and as well as other weapons of mass destruction, such as chemical weapons that we've been hearing about.
So I'll talk to the first part of your question. I mean, that would be obviously those nuclear power plants. I mean, they have safeguards in them, so they are otherwise safe if not purposely targeted. And so there was some concern that the Russians were trying to take those nuclear power plants in Ukraine, and that would create a disaster. Now, I don't see that as not only I do not see that as in Russia's interest, nor do I see that as the Russians perceiving that in their interests. That would just be an act of terrorism. There would be no political outcome conducive to Russia's interests to do that. And so if there's any silver lining here, I think that that's something that we can, as long as the Russians can be made to understand that any kind of warfare near that facility or any facilities is volatile and very, very dangerous. And so far, I believe that it has been determined that that is safe right now in Ukraine, at least, that there's not a threat of a leak that could be harmful to the civilians in Ukraine. The second piece is more concerning to me, because chemical weapons are inherently terror weapons. So nuclear weapons have a military dimension. The reason that the United States has nuclear weapons is because they do have high explosive capability. There's a military utility that we could conceive of using that would fall in line with the United States' view of the laws of war. The laws of war get their principles from the just war theory. And so there has to be a military dimension because the United States does not intentionally target civilians. So we do not use chemical weapons in warfare. Chemical weapons have been banned. Chemical weapons are unwieldy things. They are meant to maximize the suffering. That's, when you see them being employed by the Assad regime in Syria, it's women and children who are suffering from chemical weapons. The wind can blow them and take those chemical weapons across whole city populations. And so they are, the purpose of them, for those who use them, is to increase the suffering of the people, to try to compel that government to sue for peace. So I'm concerned about that. The Russians have been willing to violate the chemical weapons ban by using prohibited nerve agents in assassination attempts on NATO soil, on British soil. And so we know that they're willing to cross that line. The Russians have supported the Assad regime in Syria. And, when in 2014, I believe it was, when Assad crossed President Obama's red line about employing chemical weapons, the Obama administration turned to the Russians as a broker of this deal with the Syrian government to send in inspectors and to go in and remove chemical weapons. The United States counted on the Russians to make sure that happened. Of course, Secretary Kerry at the time kind of infamously announced that all the chemical weapons had been removed from Syria, and they weren't. Assad continued to use chemical weapons after they were supposedly removed. And so the Russians they have a very, very spotty past at best. And when it comes to chemical weapons and their toleration for using them, and their willingness to see them employed and then to employ them themselves in various capacities. So I am concerned about that in the Ukraine crisis. I think that is a more likely scenario than the other scenarios that we have discussed already.
It's so amazing is how you keep coming back to these classic principles in the just war tradition that have become the laws of armed conflict, things like non-combatant immunity and things that are rooted in a Judeo-Christian understanding of the value of human life and the protection of the political innocence. In other words, like you said, women and children, public, private property, churches, hospitals, other types of things, and just non-combatants more generally, and how much of this invasion violates those fundamental principles. Now, we've talked about three basically nuclear powers at this point. We've talked about the US, we've talked about NATO, we've talked about the Russians, but there is a fourth nuclear power that's been in the news, and that's China. Is there a China angle from your perspective in all of this?
There is a China angle, and if I could wanted to foot stomp what you just said so eloquently about the just war tradition, just for your audience too. I mean, it is something that makes the United States and the West different, and it's something that actually makes us very different. So in a world right now in which there's all kinds of moral ambiguity and confusion and moral relativism, this is something where we can point to and say, even when the United States has not done this well, we know that we haven't done it well because we do have a standard of which we look to. And that is the just war tradition. The just war tradition does in fact inform how our military officers and everybody who goes to the military academies are trained to fight, how the United States fights. And it is based on the just war tradition is really this cacophony. It's not any one specific thing, but it is this, it is a scholarship that goes all the way back to Cicero, and really before. I mean, it's the Old Testament, and it's Cicero, and it's Augustine, and it's Aquinas, it's Luther, and it's Calvin, and it's Ramsey. I mean, these are there's a robust and vibrant Protestant scholarship that has added to the just war tradition, and And it goes back to the Old Testament and Jewish understanding of God's law of what is right and wrong in terms of justice and warfare. And this really has informed positive international law, but it's informed the way the United States, our own Pentagon, thinks about justice in war. And it has to do with those principles you laid out about we discriminate against combatants and non-combatants. And actually, one more big point that Christians especially should know too is it's not pacifist, obviously. It's based on this idea, though, that war is awful. And so it has a bias against warfare. We would like to not do it because the moral questions are so fraught. There's just killing and there's unjust killing. And so there's a bias against it, but understanding that we're in a broken world, how do we then follow God's design for justice? And it's motivated in the West and just war tradition out of a desire to protect the innocent. And it has to do with just authority. It's the government's responsibility. It's not the church's responsibility. It's the government's responsibility to protect it's their people. And so how do we do it justly? And how can the just warrior, who is a Christian in good conscience, participate in this worldly endeavor to with the civil authorities to protect the innocent and to do it so in line with God's justice? So that's just I think it's so important for Christians to understand how it is informed with how the United States thinks about warfare. It has a very deeply theological roots to it. But
Rebecca,
China,
let me just pick up on that before you do just a small commercial. That one of our other interviews that people should look at is Father Alexander Webster, a Russian Orthodox priest in the United States who served for 24 years as a U.S. Army chaplain, retiring to the rank of colonel, and operating from an Eastern Orthodox perspective on what he calls justifiable war, a parallel Christian tradition. He goes through very carefully what those criteria are and takes apart this war as utterly incomprehensible from those standards. It'd be something that someone who's interested in this would want to watch that one. Back to you.
That sounds great. And I'm interested in hearing it too. Yeah, on all, if you look at in terms of just cause for entering the war, the Russians have failed that in Ukraine. If you look for just prosecution of the war and carrying out, the Russians have failed that on just about every count. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are perfectly justifiable on matters of just war to defend themselves and to protect their innocent and try to get to a just peace. And that's the other part of it. It's not peace at any cost. We as Christians, seek justice, and so it must be just. And so, in that regard, the Ukrainians are in the right, and they are the ones that are seeking to, and we ought to, hold them to account, and they are, carry out and prosecute just war in the defense of their people. But the China component is just that, China is the number one power in the world that has the ability to do the most harm to the United States and the most harmony and the most desire. They would like to see an end to a US-led order in trade policy, in commerce, in things like international institutions in which there is the thumbprint of what the United States holds as our principles, the dignity of the human person, and what that and how that is manifested in a variety of ways, dependent on the various cultural idiosyncrasies within these other democracies, which we're allies with. And the Chinese would like it to be a China-led order, and so China is always looking to figure out how to undermine those various pressure points so that they can take the advantage and weaken the United States. China has kind of had a little bit of a cooler approach towards Russia, not really sure if their interests would align sufficiently. They have now moved much closer together, and I have described their relationship as a de facto alliance. They've cooperated in a variety of ways that are very concerning. And in the Ukraine crisis, China has defended the Russians' pretext for the invasion. The Chinese have said that they believe that Putin is right, that NATO has been having an aggressive posture towards Russia, and the Russians are acting defensively. The Chinese have not chosen to condemn the way the Russians are prosecuting this war. And then there was media reports that when the United States went to China, the Biden administration went to China to try to convince the Chinese to talk Putin out of invading. They shared some intelligence with the Chinese about what we knew about the Russians, and the Chinese shared that information with the Russians. So time and again, the Chinese are collaborating to a certain degree with what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. And then they've also, during the Olympics, Putin went to Beijing with Xi Jinping, and they signed an agreement, and they announced that the depths of their friendship essentially had no limits, and they would cooperate both on energy and on global food supply. Those two things are very concerning for the West, the United States, because they can wield them as weapons, and we're already seeing that. I mean, once Ukraine is understood as the breadbasket of Europe because of its rich and fertile soil. When Russia invaded Ukraine on day one, Russia effectively had control of 1/3 of the world's wheat exports. And so you think about the countries that are more fragile, that are dependent on Ukrainian wheat. And then you think about the turmoil and the suffering that can go up if Russia wields that as a weapon. So I'm tracking this China and Russia dynamic. And then there's, the most recent media reports are that the Russians have asked the Chinese for essentially help with continuing to fight the war in Ukraine, and they need more weapons. If that's true, that would be a very concerning development, especially if the Chinese agreed to do that. Then you essentially have, the United States and the West arming Ukraine, and then the Chinese Communist Party arming Russia. That would be a very, very, very terrible turn of events, of which all of us should be hoping and praying that is not what happens.
Well, you've hit a lot of notes here: food security, energy security. All of this is mixed up in this, and of course, two really rival ways of seeing the individual and the community. One that is rules-based, that focuses both on individual rights and community rights, and the way that those things, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, the right to assemble, the right to open, transparent information, what we call the freedom of the press, and at its heart, religious liberty and religious pluralism. What a difference between that set of values, which Ukraine has been orienting towards over the past 25 years, in contrast to this new axis between Moscow and Beijing, which actually runs counter to that on every front, and in particular, the value of religious freedom and basic human rights. So, Rebecca, thank you very, very much for your time today. This is a very illuminating talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to join you.